History is peppered with puzzling disappearances, entire groups of people vanishing without warning or trace. While many of these events are eventually explained by natural disasters, conflict, or migration, there are a few that defy all logic. This story explores one such eerie event: the mysterious disappearance of an entire Inuit village near Lake Anjikuni. It was early morning when Joe LeBlanc pushed off from the riverbank, his canoe laden with traps, worn tools, and a few animal pelts. The sun had only just peeked over the treetops. The air, though crisp, was unusually mild for a November morning in the vast wilderness of Canada's Northwest Territories. For someone with Joe's experience, the chill was manageable. It wasn't the cold that had driven him to paddle onward, but hunger. His most recent trek through the forest had been fruitless. Game was scarce, and his provisions were running dangerously low. Fortunately, Joe remembered a small Inuit settlement located along the shores of Lake Anjikuni. In years past, he had traded furs there for smoked fish, dried meats, and sometimes even the comfort of warm company. He hoped the villagers would be just as welcoming this time. After an hour paddling along the icy waters, Joe spotted a wisp of smoke rising in the distance, thin and gray, coiling skyward. A smile crossed his windburned face as he turned his canoe toward it, relieved that someone was home. As the outlines of huts and sheds emerged from the tree line, Joe guided his canoe to the frosted shoreline. The familiar structures looked as they always had, but something felt off. At first, the silence didn't alarm him. It was early, and perhaps the villagers were still sleeping or out hunting. But as he stepped carefully between the huts, it became clear that no one was around. Not a single voice, no laughter, no movement. Every dwelling was deserted. What made it even more unsettling was the way the village had been left. Campfires still smoldered in pits, and food sat prepared, but uncooked near the fire circles. Some of the huts had furs hanging to dry, half-folded clothing, and bowls of untouched stew. It was as if everyone had stood up and walked away in the middle of their daily chores. Concerned but curious, Joe began to search the area more thoroughly. He ventured to the edge of the settlement and stumbled upon something deeply disturbing: the sled dogs. Every last one of them was dead, lying in the snow like twisted statues. The poor creatures hadn't been attacked. They looked starved, their ribs pressing against thin fur. Even more chilling was what Joe found at the village's burial site. Graves had been dug up. Where once rested the remains of ancestors, now there were only open, icy voids. Headstones had been moved, but neatly, not as if wild animals had scavenged here. A gnawing unease grew in Joe's gut. Something was deeply wrong. But with daylight fading fast, he had to make a decision: stay the night in the abandoned village or leave before nightfall. Not wanting to risk the dark, he quickly gathered as much food and supplies as he could carry, loaded his canoe, and pushed off. As the shoreline receded behind him, Joe turned for one last look. What he saw made his blood run cold. The entire village seemed bathed in an eerie, bluish glow, radiating from beyond the horizon. Without waiting to understand it, he began paddling faster, desperate to put distance fully rewritten for reuse. Safety while keeping the story structure and sequence exactly the same. A few weeks later, in early January 1931, a small team of Royal Canadian Mounted Police departed from their remote barracks in Manitoba. The unit, led by Sergeant J. Nelson, faced a punishing 560-mile trek across unforgiving terrain. Their destination, Lake Anjikuni. The reason? A confusing, fragmented telegram that had arrived days earlier from none other than Joe LeBlanc. The message had been vague and unsettling. Something about an entire village gone, graves disturbed, and lights in the sky. Though the wording was unclear, the concern in Joe's tone had been enough to warrant investigation. The journey was long and grueling, but largely uneventful. As they approached the lake, Nelson instructed his men to begin asking discreet questions of hunters and tribal members they encountered. He wanted to confirm whether anyone else had seen or heard anything unusual. Their inquiries first brought them to a medical outpost where an Inuit trapper named Sock was being treated for severe frostbite. The man had been found alone in a snowdrift by a group of passing hunters, barely alive. His legs had frozen to the point of numbness, and he remained bedridden, dazed, and feverish. When questioned, Sok mumbled incoherently, whispering strange warnings about a malevolent spirit called Tornrak, a being from Inuit lore, said to bring storms and suffering. The Mounties, trained in logic and evidence, chalked it up to hallucinations caused by his condition. They moved on. Their next lead came from a village roughly 150 miles from Anjikuni. The elders there told of a boy, around 10 years old, who had arrived alone during a blizzard 2 months earlier. The child hadn't said a word since his arrival. No one knew where he had come from, and nearby communities didn't claim him. It was as if he'd materialized out of thin air. More disturbing still was the testimony of a local trapper named Armand Luron. He told Sergeant Nelson and his team that over the past few months, he and his 2 sons had observed strange, luminous blue lights floating through the night sky. These lights didn't behave like natural phenomena. They would follow them, hover silently, and sometimes vanish without warning. Luron also described a bizarre airborne object, a large, metallic cylinder that had hovered above the forest before transforming mid-air into a sleek, bullet-shaped form. Then it shot off toward Lake Anjikuni at a speed no known aircraft could achieve. By the time the Mounties reached the abandoned settlement, they found it exactly as LeBlanc had described, silent, empty, and haunting. The village had likely housed around 30 people, but now there was no trace of a single soul. Nelson instructed his team to fan out and examine the perimeter, while he made his way deeper into the heart of the settlement alone. Notebook in hand, he documented what he saw. Rotting food still stuck to the sides of pots over dead fire pits, partially sewn garments left in mid-repair, and sleds still packed as if ready to travel, yet untouched. In one hut, a child's coat lay neatly folded beside a needle and thread. In another, the stench of spoiled meat lingered in the frigid air. It was as though every daily task had been abandoned in an instant. At the edge of the village, just as Joe had claimed, the bodies of the sled dogs lay frozen in the snow. Their emaciated forms indicated starvation, but why hadn't they been fed? Even more puzzling, why hadn't they torn into the plentiful food stores left behind? Nelson soon rejoined his officers at the village burial ground. What they found there deepened the mystery. Several graves had been emptied. Gaping holes yawned in the snow-covered earth, yet the ice surrounding them showed no sign of being dug by tools or even by hand. The cuts were too clean, too precise. Nearby, the headstones had been carefully removed and stacked into 2 neat piles, not the chaotic work of animals or natural forces. After thoroughly surveying the area, Sergeant Nelson made the decision to leave. With no bodies, no signs of violence, and no apparent theft or struggle, there was little else they could do. They mounted their horses and began the long ride back to Manitoba. Upon returning to headquarters, Nelson submitted his official report. It confirmed that the village was indeed abandoned, and the accounts given by Joe LeBlanc had been largely accurate. But the sergeant concluded that no criminal act had taken place and found no evidence of foul play. He did, however, note something curious about LeBlanc. Despite claiming to be a seasoned trapper, Joe had only applied for his first official trapping license a year earlier. He had also sold his story to the Halifax Herald, a newspaper infamous for publishing outlandish tales with little verification. Still, the Mounties' own findings supported nearly every detail of Joe's report. Despite Sergeant Nelson's skepticism, his own investigation had failed to produce any evidence that contradicted Joe LeBlanc's version of events. Every strange detail, from the abandoned fires to the dug-up graves and starved sled dogs, matched exactly what Joe had reported. There was no indication of violence, no tracks leading away, and no signs of panic or haste. It was as though the villagers had simply stood up in the middle of their lives and walked into nothingness. Even more baffling, nothing had been taken. The sleds were still there, kayaks pulled up along the shore, and tools left lying in place. Food was plentiful and untouched, yet the dogs had perished from hunger. This contradicted every instinct and survival practice of the Inuit, for whom caring for sled dogs was essential to life in the north. Something profound had stopped them from tending even to their animals. And then there were the graves. To disturb a burial site, especially within Inuit culture, was a deeply taboo act. The dead were honored and left to rest in peace. But someone, or something, had carefully removed the remains. Yet how? The surrounding snow and ice showed no signs of shovels, digging tools, or physical disruption. It was as if the graves had been opened cleanly from beneath or by some invisible force. Sergeant Nelson had his doubts about Joe's credentials. The man's recently acquired trapping license suggested he might not have been as seasoned as he claimed. However, that didn't mean his account was fictional. Many experienced trappers operated without licenses until forced to comply with regulations, especially in the remote north. And Joe's description of the village matched perfectly with the Mountie's own observations, down to the eerie blue glow he claimed to have seen as he paddled away. More importantly, Joe had made no wild claims about what had happened. He hadn't blamed spirits, invaders, or aliens. He'd merely reported what he saw, and that testimony had now been confirmed by a federal investigation as to what had happened to the people of the Anjikuni village. Some proposed that the villagers had fled due to fear, perhaps of an approaching epidemic, an aggressive neighboring group, or an unknown environmental threat. But this theory fell apart under closer examination. Why would they leave behind all their supplies, food, sleds, and tools? Why abandon the dogs? And why remove the dead? Others attempted to explain the lights and flying object that Armand Luron and his sons had reported as nothing more than natural atmospheric phenomena, the aurora borealis, for instance. But Armand, a lifelong woodsman, was no stranger to northern lights. He insisted what they had witnessed was not natural. The object they saw hovered, changed shape, and moved in ways no light display or known aircraft ever could. Over the years, whispers circulated about that RCMP patrol and what they might have truly witnessed during their mission to Anjikuni. Some claimed the Mounties themselves had seen the strange blue lights in the sky and had been ordered never to speak of it. Officially, however, nothing out of the ordinary was acknowledged. Speculation soon turned toward more unconventional explanations. Could it have been, as some dared to suggest, a case of alien abduction? The idea sounded outrageous. And yet, what other force could remove 30 people, their dead, and leave no footprints, no blood, and no destruction? What of the frostbitten trapper, Sock, and his mention of Tornrak, the ancient spirit feared in Inuit mythology? Described as a towering, tusked figure with the power to summon deadly snowstorms and manipulate nature itself, Tornrak was more than a ghost story. In Inuit culture, spirits like Tornrak served as both warnings and explanations for terrifying events in the harsh, unforgiving north. Sock, broken and frozen in the snow, had whispered of this spirit before slipping into unconsciousness. Had he been the only survivor? Had he seen something no man should? There are countless legends throughout North America about strange beings dwelling in the deep wilderness. Tales of Sasquatch, towering ape-like creatures roaming the forests. Reports of lake monsters, serpent-like beings hiding beneath the waves. Is it possible that Tornrak, or something like it, was more than just myth? Others proposed an entirely different theory, that the region near Anjikuni Lake might house hidden gateways between dimensions. Stories of strange disappearances, ships lost in calm weather, planes vanishing from clear skies, have led some to believe in the existence of weak spots in the fabric of our reality. Could the villagers have slipped through such a breach? Could that bluish light Joe saw have been more than a glow, a rip in space-time? In the years following the incident, the mystery of the disappearing village continued to circulate among curious investigators, writers, and conspiracy theorists. Several authors tried to reopen the case, requesting official statements and further evidence from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. But the RCMP maintained a consistent stance. No foul play had been discovered, and the event was either exaggerated or entirely fabricated. Yet even that explanation didn't fully satisfy the questions raised by Nelson's original report. His investigation, however thorough, had produced no logical answer. Only confirmation of the unsettling facts first brought forward by Joe LeBlanc. As the story gained attention, inconsistencies began appearing in later versions. Some publications inflated the number of graves disturbed. Others described the village as being made up of tents rather than permanent wooden cabins. Such details sparked theories that Joe may have encountered a temporary, nomadic settlement, and that the inhabitants had simply relocated. Perhaps, the argument went, He had stumbled upon a seasonal encampment rather than a permanent community. But even if that were true, why would such a group abandon the camp without their animals, without their tools or food, and why disturb the graves? Skeptics speculated that Joe might have embellished parts of the story to make it more dramatic before selling it to the Halifax Herald, a publication with a reputation for publishing outlandish tales. Maybe he had even staged certain parts of the village to look abandoned and eerie, hoping it would attract attention and reward. Still, none of that could explain the findings of Sergeant Nelson and his men, all of which closely matched Joe's report. And so, the debate continues. Those who favor rational explanations argue that natural causes, cultural misunderstandings, or plain misreporting were to blame. Others, more open to extraordinary possibilities, suggest something truly otherworldly occurred at Lake Anjikuni. A government cover-up, a paranormal event, or perhaps even a mass abduction. But with decades now separating us from that November morning in 1930, the truth, whatever it may be, seems lost to time. No further evidence has emerged. No survivors ever came forward. The child found in the storm remained silent, and the strange lights seen above the trees have never been officially investigated again. What happened to those 30 people who once called that lakeside village home? Were they taken by force? Did they vanish into another world? Or did something ancient and unknown rise from the frozen north to claim them? We may never know. What is certain is that the Canadian wilderness has always held secrets, and in the heart of its vast, frozen reaches, some of those secrets remain untouched, unanswered, and perhaps unknowable.